PA Books is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. I'm Phil Beckman. PA Books features interviews with authors on Pennsylvania history, culture, and people. In this episode, we talk with Eric Jay Dolin about his book, Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution.
This week on PA Books, Eric Jay Dolin, author of Rebels at Sea.
Eric Jay Dolin is the author of Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution. Eric, in your book, you say privateering has long been given short shrift in the general histories of the conflict. Why?
Why? There are probably a number of reasons, one of which is a lot of people at the time during the American Revolution and shortly thereafter chose to highlight the activities of generals and the elites and the Continental Navy, as opposed to focusing on privateers, which many people back then considered to be licensed piracy, which I strongly disagree with, but they were considered less than admirable. They were viewed as being sort of driven by the profit motive instead of civic responsibility or patriotism, which I also think is an unfair characterization. But another reason is that when you win a war, many of the people who write the histories are the winners, and in this case, many of them were the elites, the generals, the congressmen, the diplomats. They're the ones that wrote the history of the American Revolution in the early years. They're the ones that penned their memoirs. A lot of privateersmen were from the lower strata of society, just like many of the men who fought in the Continental Army and the Continental Navy. And they weren't typically the type of people to write memoirs about their experiences. After the war, they went on to go back to being fishermen or being on merchant ships. And very few of them, unfortunately, wrote their autobiographies. But a lot of the generals and upper echelon of society, a lot of them did write their autobiographies, or they contributed to histories of the time. And I just think that privateering got sort of lost in the shuffle, despite the fact that many people at the time knew that it was an integral part of our Revolutionary War strategy and that it was important to the success of the war. But it was just sort of I guess there were some aspersions casted towards privateers, and they were too facilely lumped with piracy. And that's probably a big part of the reason that they didn't get their due in the decades after the American Revolution. And a lot of historians after that chose instead to focus on the land battles or the few Continental Navy battles, such as the ones with John Paul Jones, that were very dramatic. And instead of looking at the day-to-day workings of these privateers, thousands of them, that were out there attacking British shipping.
Well, let's talk about that distinction between privateers and pirates. Privateers were issued letters of marque. What were those, and what was the legal basis of their actions?
Well, privateers are armed ships that were owned and operated by private individuals that were given government permission to attack enemy ships during times of war. That permission came in the form, as you mentioned, of a letter of marque, which is a formal legal document that gave the bearer or the owner of the ship and the people on the ship the right to attack enemy ships and bring them in as spoils of war. And then once it was determined to be an actual British ship, which is a valid prize by the local Court of Admiralty, or the local court that adjudicated that, the owners of the privateer would be able to sell the ship they captured, all of its cargo, and the proceeds from those auctions would be split evenly between the owners and investors in the privateers, and the actual men who are on board the privateers who captured the ships. So it was a way to create a free navy to some extent, when at the beginning of the American Revolution, we had no navy at all. So it was a very good way, given the opportunities that we had, to get a fighting force on the sea quickly to harass British shipping, primarily merchant ships, but privateers, American privateers, also captured and tangled with a few British warships. And they also captured many British privateers, because Great Britain started issuing their own letters of marque in 1777 to counteract the effectiveness of the American privateering force.
How significant was Philadelphia as a port for privateers?
Oh, it was a major port for privateering. Pennsylvania in particular was right up there with Massachusetts and Connecticut in issuing the most privateering licenses. There's a number of great stories that come out of Philadelphia. One of the ones that I find most fascinating has to do with a guy named James Forten. And he was a black man, a free man. He was a teenager at the time in 1781. He was 14. His parents were both free, which was quite unusual at the time, even in Philadelphia. And he signed on to the privateer Royal Lewis, which was captained by a guy named Stephen Decatur Sr. in the summer of 1781. And there are a couple of reasons why James Forten, a black man, decided to sign on to a privateer. One of which is that on July 8th, when the Declaration of Independence was read for the first time in Philadelphia, James Forten happened to be in the audience. And he heard those immortal words, "All men are created equal." And he thought, well, maybe if we get our own country, maybe those words will actually apply to me and other people of my complexion. And then also in 1781, as you know, the Pennsylvania passed the gradual abolition of slavery law, which was the first one in the United States. And that also gave him some hope. So he signed on to be a privateer on the Royal Lewis. He was the guy that would bring the gunpowder to the cannons. And the Royal Lewis went out and caught 7 prizes, brought them back to the docks in Philadelphia, sold them for quite a bit of money. So he pocketed some money. He got very excited, and he immediately signed on for another round at sea on the Royal Lewis. And in hindsight, he shouldn't have been so eager, because barely a day out of port, the Royal Lewis was captured by the HMS Amphion, which was captained by a guy named John Beasley. So all of a sudden, Forten was very concerned, because he knew that historically, British ships that captured American ships that had men on board of his complexion, he would likely be sent to the Caribbean slave marts to be sold into slavery. And he thought that was going to be his end. But fortunately for him, John Beasley had a 12-year-old son on board who needed a companion, and Beasley tapped Forten to be that companion. And over the next few weeks, as the ship, the Amphion, sailed towards New York Harbor, which was under British control at the time, Forten got along very well with Beasley's son. So when they pulled into New York Harbor, Beasley gave Forten a choice. He said, "You can either go back to London as the ward of my son, and you'll have money, freedom, education, or you can be disembarked here with the other men of the Royal Lewis and go on board one of the prison ships in New York Harbor. What do you decide?" Well, James Forten was a true patriot. He said, "I'm going to go with my men," and he did. And Beasley did a very nice thing. He spoke to the superintendent of prisons in New York, who was sort of a dirty piece of work, and he basically said to him, "Listen, James Forten, he's a good, honorable young man. If you ever have a prisoner exchange, please include him," which would have been very unusual under other circumstances to have a black man be included in a prisoner exchange. But 8 months later, after James Forten survived for 8 months on the Jersey, which was the most notorious of all prison ships It was called Hell Afloat. There was a prisoner exchange. The superintendent remembered what Captain John Baisley had requested, and James Forten got to go back to Philadelphia. And this is very important for Philadelphia's future history and the anti-slavery efforts in the country, because James Forten, after the war, became one of the foremost sailmakers in Philadelphia. When he died in 1842, his estate was worth about $70,000, which is probably in the order of $3 to $4 million today. And earlier, he had helped William Lloyd Garrison, a friend of his, found the Liberator, the newspaper that played a major role in fomenting anti-slavery sentiment in the United States, and thereby played an important role, I think, in the ultimate dissolution of slavery in the Civil War. So James Forten was just a fascinating story. There's another owner named McClenahan out of Philadelphia, owned a whole bunch of King McClenahan. He owned a whole bunch of privateers. There was the Holker, which was probably the most successful American privateer, which sailed out of Philadelphia over the span of 4 years with multiple captains on 11 different cruises. The Holker captured nearly 70 British ships, which sold on the wharves in Philadelphia for as much as $2 million. So Philadelphia, as you might expect, it was a major city in the colonies, and along with Boston and Philadelphia and New London, played a major role in America's privateering efforts.
Now, you mentioned the Holker, and in the book you talk about how there was a battle off the New Jersey coast with the British ship, the Admiral Rodney, which had also been a prior privateering ship. Can you talk about that battle and give us a sense of what a battle between these privateering ships would have been like?
Well, I give you a generic sense of the battle. Here, this is something we chatted about right before we got on board. Yes, I did write this book, and I did all the research, and it was really fascinating. But that was 3 books ago, and I probably have, even though I've looked over my book a number of times, I have a tough time detailing the exact course of every single battle that I talk about in the book. However, I can tell you more generically what happened. And when we get to the pirate privateer distinction, there's an interesting parallel there. But basically, when a privateer went out, it was heavily armed. Let's say you had a 60-foot privateer. If that was a 60-foot fishing vessel, which what the privateering vessel might have been before the war, you could probably have 6, maybe 10 or 12 people on board, easily handle that ship, no problem. A privateering vessel that went out, 60, 70 feet long, would be heavily armed with cannons and swivel guns and muskets and cutlasses. And there may be as many as 100 people on board for a very specific reason. When you went out as a privateer, you wanted to appear very, very fierce and formidable so that you got the ultimate result, which was to get the merchant ship that you wanted to take to surrender without firing a shot. Now, a lot of British merchant ships at the time were armed. Some of them were heavily armed. But if you pulled up to a British merchant ship that might have 12 men on board, and you were on an American privateer that had 100 men on board, heavily armed, whooping and hollering, you might decide that despite what you wanted to stand up for the owner of the ship, you're going to surrender because you had no chance against this privateer. And most of the time, that's the way that American privateers took their prizes, without firing a shot. Now, it wasn't a very simple process because you're out in the open ocean. A lot of ships used false flags or ruse de guerre. They would, like an American privateer would sometimes have a French flag on its main mast or a British flag to try to lull the ship that they're approaching into a false sense of security. And the British ships might do the same thing. So if you couldn't immediately tell by the nature of the ship and the men on board and or the flag it was flying, whether it was a British ship, you had to get in closer, maybe within trumpeting range, and ask them, who are you? Identify yourself. And if they identified themselves as a British ship, then you would threaten them and hopefully take them without firing a shot. If the British ship suddenly responded with gunfire or tried to escape, the chase would be on, and the Americans would often have to engage in a battle. And there were a number of battles that took place on the open ocean. In some of them, American privateers lost. In others, it was a draw. And in others, the American privateers got the better of the British and were able to bring that British prize into port as a prize. So it really was a game of cat and mouse. And the reason I mentioned pirates is a lot of people like to think of American pirates like Blackbeard and Sam Bellamy and Captain Kidd to some extent as these were heavily armed men who went out in the open ocean, and they were constantly getting into fights, bloody battles. But the real truth is most pirates were able to intimidate their victims into giving up without a fight. Because when you saw a heavily armed pirate ship coming towards you with the Jolly Roger or black flag on its main mast, most merchant ships would surrender immediately. So it was this parallel situation with privateers. British merchant ships, despite their armaments, were usually not heavily staffed. And the better tact from their perspective was to surrender rather than potentially give their lives in defense of the merchant vessel.
Well, let's go back to some of the political debates about privateering. Was Congress, the Continental Congress, immediately open to the idea of privateering, or did it take some persuasion?
Yeah, they weren't immediately open. The first colony that got into privateering was Massachusetts, the colony where I'm sitting on their soil here in Marblehead, Massachusetts. They, in November of 1775, decided to start issuing letters of marque. And that's largely because, Boston and Massachusetts was the locus of Great Britain's enmity at the time. And they wanted to defend themselves to some extent on the open ocean from increasing attacks or threats from British Navy. And they had experience in privateering in the 7 Years' Wars and other wars that occurred earlier in the century. They had a lot of fishermen who had been thrown out of work because of the American Revolution. So they were skilled in handling boats, and they wanted to find a way to potentially earn some money. And there were a lot of Massachusetts politicians, such as Elbridge Gerry, who grew up here in Marblehead, and John Adams, who were big fans of privateering. So the Massachusetts legislature passed its own privateering statute on November 5th of 1775. Then New York and Rhode Island followed suit, in Connecticut. But people were starting to argue that the Continental Congress should pass their own privateering statute. The argument being, instead of having a piecemeal privateering naval armada created colony by colony, why not have Continental Congress pass a law that allows for the issuance of letters of marque so that every single colony could participate in this new form of warfare, not new form, but this new form for the American Revolution. So in March of 1776, Congress finally decided, after some healthy debate, to pass their own privateering statute. And all of a sudden, any colony could issue a letter of marque. And there was a flood of them that started to be issued, especially as we approached the Declaration of Independence, because everybody wanted to, one, strike a blow for the revolutionary cause, two, potentially earn some money. And it really became a speculative frenzy in the colonies. And it wasn't only the merchant kings who invested in privateering. People like George Washington, General Nathaniel Greene, General Henry Knox, Paul Revere, Robert Morris, the financier of the Revolution, all of these men and many other elites in the colonies invested in privateering, taking a part as an investor. Because what would happen is the owner of the ship would also often invite other people in to take out a share in the success of this privateer. And even the men who were the privateers on board the ship would sometimes sell their shares to other people. There's a great story of a guy in New Hampshire when he went off, he told his mother, while I'm gone, if you can sell my share of the potential profits of this privateer if you get into trouble. And his name was Andrew Sherburne. So while he was away, his mother was left to tend to their farm, and they were having a really difficult time, or she was having a difficult time. So she sold her son's share in his future profits for $70, which was a lot of money. Now, it was a risk for the person who bought the share, because what happens if Andrew Shelburne came back and he earned no money? He would have been out $70. Well, that's exactly what happened. His mother got $70 to help tide the farm over through some tough months. And the person who bought the Andrew Shelburne share and all the booty that he was going to bring back got nothing.
Now, you also talk about in the book about how slaveholders would rent their enslaved people out to these privateering ships. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Sure. At the time, both in the North and the South, of course, in all the colonies, there were people who owned enslaved individuals. And what happened is there were times that enslaved individuals ran away and signed on to a privateer as a way of achieving partial freedom and also being away from land where they could be captured, because many times the owners would put ads in local newspapers to recapture their quote unquote property. But then there were a number of people who owned enslaved individuals, the owners, who would rent out their enslaved individuals to privateers to go out on voyages. And when they came back, if the person that they rented out actually was due some cut of the money, it wouldn't go to the enslaved individual, it would go to the owner. So it really was a sort of mini economy. And if you read colonial newspapers at the time, there were quite a few ads that would say, runaway slave, we think he's gone to go privateering or he's gone someplace else. Here's his name. Here was the clothes that he was wearing when he left. Here are some of his distinguishing characteristics. We will offer 10 pounds or $20 or whatever for his capture and return. So it was a important part of the privateering equation, because there were many black men who served on privateers. How many, we don't have a good count. James Fortnum, as I mentioned before, of Philadelphia, was one, but there were others. And I want to just tell one other quick story about black individual. There's this painting, you can't see it now, but there's a painting of a black American privateer during the American Revolution. And it was owned by a urologist who lived in Rhode Island, and it was considered to be unique. And as such, it was valued at $300,000 because there are no other paintings like that. And he had loaned out the image to be used in many books about the American Revolution. And in the year 2000, France's Tavern Museum in New York City wanted to use that picture as the centerpiece of their exhibit on the role of black individuals in the American Revolution. So they contacted the urologist. He was excited. He sent out the picture to be, fixed up a little bit and made look better. The art restorer took a solvent, started rubbing one of the fingers on the gentleman in the picture. Off came the black paint, revealing a white finger beneath. Turned out that in the 20th century, somebody who realized that a unique painting of a black American privateersman during the American Revolution would be much more valuable than a rare and unusual but not unique painting of a white American mariner during the American Revolution, doctored or painted over the painting. Well, that person was correct, because once it was found to be a forgery, the value plummeted from $300,000 to $3,000, and the France's Tavern Museum backed out of using it as the centerpiece for their exhibit, their upcoming exhibit. So I said that there's a great picture of this painting in the book, and anyway, I just thought that was an interesting story that relates to Black individuals during the American Revolution and their role in privateering.
What regions did privateers target to search for British merchant ships?
Well, they would go anywhere where the prey was. One of the most lucrative areas was in the Caribbean because, as you probably know, the Great Britain's number one source of external funding during this time was not trade with the East India Company in the Indian or Mughal Empire in the Indian Ocean. It was really trade with the sugar colonies in the Caribbean. So that meant there was an awful lot of shipping that went from Great Britain down to the sugar colonies, either stopping in Africa or other places before getting there. So there were many hundreds of British merchant ships that were captured in the Caribbean. They also would capture them off the East Coast. You know, the New York and Charleston, South Carolina, at one time or another, was under British control. So there were a lot of supply ships that went down to those two places. So they would capture them along the coast of the East Coast of America. They would also go over to the continent and capture ships within the English Channel, off France, and even off Africa, because the British continued to engage in the slave trade during the American Revolution, although it was much diminished. So some American privateersmen would send ships over to the coast of Africa specifically to capture British slave ships, which were very, very valuable, not only the ship, but the cargo, and they would bring it back to the colonies and sell the human cargo, essentially. And that was another money-making operation. John Brown, who is the namesake for Brown University, where I went to college, he had a whole fleet of privateers, many of which that he sent specifically to the coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, to catch British slavers and make money in that means. And I want to tell one story that's related to Philadelphia. There was a guy named William Bingham who was appointed by the Continental Congress right around the time of the Declaration of Independence to go down to the French colony of Martinique. And one of his main jobs was to encourage privateering, American privateering. And that's because at the time, France was not in the war on our side, but France was allowing American privateers to use their ports to resupply, sell things occasionally, and also occasionally take on French sailors to fill out their ranks. So William Bingham, who was a wealthy man from Philadelphia, had just finished, not too long before the war started, his tour of Europe. He was sent down to Martinique, and he did an excellent job because in 1778, it was estimated that American privateers had captured somewhere in the order of 250 British ships in and around the Caribbean and in and around Martinique. And this caused great distress in Great Britain because, as I mentioned before, the number one source of their foreign income came from this region. And in fact, 66% of the trade dropped off at this time, British trade to the Caribbean. And that reduction was so precipitous and so consequential that one of the members of Parliament argued that Parliament should not make those numbers known to the public because it would show the weakness of the nation. But it was ultimately made public anyway. So that was one of the roles of France and the roles of some more Philadelphians in helping with our American revolutionary effort. And I will mention, I did mention Robert Morris, who of course many people in Pennsylvania will have heard about. He's also from there. He was the financier of the revolution. He was a very wealthy man, but he also invested heavily in privateers. And he's the one who, to paraphrase, said, you should always be sending privateers out, as many as you can, because for each 3 failures, by which he meant a ship that comes back with no prizes or is captured, for each 3 failures, if you have one big success, that'll cover your 3 losses. And that was a good sort of metaphor for privateering in general, because many American privateers either were not successful in their cruises or were captured by British ships. But if you had one big success or multiple successes, like the Holker, that could make up for a lot of your losses.
We'll be back in a moment with the PA Books Podcast.
Enjoying this podcast? Please support PCN with a donation at pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Now, you mentioned that some privateers were captured by the British. How were the privateer crews treated by the British?
Oh, that was interesting. Well, the British viewed American privateers as pirates, which is a little bit rich or ironic, because the British were the people who basically inaugurated privateering back in the 13th century and had used it in almost every single war that they had engaged in, including many of the wars that took place while the American colonies were part of Great Britain. So at the beginning of the war, Britain was not issuing any letters of marque on its own. They really looked down on American privateers as nothing more than pirates and hooligans. They had a better view of the Continental Navy because that was viewed more as parallel to the British Navy. So what would happen is when the British would capture an American privateer, the men would immediately be sent to either prisons in England, Mill or Fortin prison, or they'd be sent to one of the prison hulks, ships in New York Harbor, the Jersey, as I mentioned, being the worst, labeled hell afloat. And that was a horrible destination for privateers. And what's interesting is the Mill and Fortin prison in Great Britain had a total of about 3,000 men during the war. And the bulk of them were American privateers. The death rate in Mill and Fortin prison was about 3 to 6% per year, which is roughly on par with the average death rate during that era in prisons. Now, if you were an unfortunate American privateersman to have been sent to New York Harbor to be on one of the 19 British prison ships there, well, your fate was much worse, because during the entire course of the war, somewhere around 15 to 20,000 or more men were held on British prison ships. And the death rate was very high. The bulk of the prisoners were American privateersmen. On the Jersey, for example, any day there would be between 800 and 1,200 Americans on board, mostly American privateersmen, below decks. It was a miserable existence. Every day, between 6 and 12 prisoners died. The British soldiers who were overseeing the Jersey would yell down to the Americans, "Bring up your dead." And not only would they have to bring up their dead comrades or compatriots, they would also have to get into a whaleboat and row the dead men to shore and bury them in shallow graves. And just imagine that. The Jersey was moored in maybe 15 feet of water, 20 feet of water. It's a former 64-gun British warship that's been dismasted, and it's only a couple of 100 yards from shore. So these men had to row to shore, bury their friends or fellow privateersmen or soldiers or Continental Navy men. And then when bad weather came, since the graves were very close to the shore, sometimes they would be uncovered. So you would be able to see that from the ship in the hour or so that each man was allowed to come above deck and breathe some fresh air. But it was just an absolutely abysmal experience. And although estimates are difficult to come by, the best estimate of all is how many men died on board the Jersey alone, the largest British warship, was somewhere around 11,000 men. And to put that in perspective, during the entire war in the direct line of action, somewhere between about 4,500 and 6,800 men, Americans, died. And it bears repeating that of those 11,000 men who died on board the Jersey, the vast majority of them were American privateersmen.
Now, we talked a little bit about the French in the West Indies, but Benjamin Franklin was in France during part of the war as well, and he was active in facilitating privateering out of France. What was he trying to accomplish?
Well, Benjamin Franklin, who seemed to be everywhere during the war, amazing individual, he was trying to do the thing that the Americans were trying to do, that George Washington was trying to do, basically annoy the British, harm the British to such a degree that you finally get them to give up this war that was just dragging on year after year. So one of the things Benjamin Franklin did is he worked with the French to help encourage privateering, and he even issued a number of letters of marque himself to like Luke Ryan, which is an Irish person who came down and was very successful. He got letters of marque from Benjamin Franklin that effectively made him an American privateer, and they would harry British shipping in the Channel, and it got so bad that the local newspapers were writing about how British shipping was being really negatively impacted by these American privateers. He worked with French diplomats to get them to support American privateering, both on the continent and in the Caribbean. And what this really did, and a lot of it was because of Franklin. Oh, I will back up for a second. One of the reasons that Franklin was so keen on encouraging privateering from Dunkirk and other French ports is he hoped that the privateers that he gave letters of marque to would go out and capture enough British prisoners so that they could effect a British and American prisoner exchange with London. It didn't really work out very well on that note, but the American privateers, or the privateers that Benjamin Franklin had launched, had successful careers, and they were part and parcel of the overall American privateering effort. And Americans colluding with the French, and the French harboring American privateers and provisioning them, caused major friction between France and Great Britain, and helped get France into the war on the side of the Americans. Of course, it was the Battle of Saratoga and the defeat of General John Burgoyne's army on October 17th of 1777 that really proved the turning point in getting France to finally decide that, hey, these Americans might win this war. Let's get in it and let's harm our ancient enemy, Great Britain. But privateering helped them make that decision because it greatly increased the enmity between the British and the French, and just created a general atmosphere of anger. So it was very important. I mean, the chapter I have on the French involvement goes into much greater detail than that. And it was a fascinating diplomatic dance back and forth between Britain and France, because Britain knew full well that France was helping American privateering. France would constantly say, no, we're not doing it, and they would go on doing it. And finally, it became enough of an irritant so that in Britain, there were newspapers basically saying if France didn't stop arming and protecting American privateers, an inevitable war is going to result. But right before that break, France finally got enough pressure from Britain that they told the Americans, stop privateering from French ports. But it didn't matter. That was right before the Battle of Saratoga, and when the fortunes of the Americans and the French and the British all changed in a decisive manner.
How did the Royal Navy respond to the threat posed by privateers?
Well, there were multiple ways in which the Royal Navy responded, one of which was to go out and try to capture American privateers. And they captured many of them. As we mentioned, many of them ended up in British prisons. Royal Navy also would convoy British merchant ships to protect them from being attacked by American privateers. And those were the two main ways that the British Navy was sort of involved in countering the privateering success.
Now, New York City was captured by the British early on and was occupied by British forces throughout the war. Were there loyalist privateers operating out of New York City?
Oh yeah, that's one of the most fascinating stories. A lot of people who know about the American Revolution maybe don't know as much about about Britain controlling New York during the bulk of the war. But yes, there were a lot of loyalists in New York, and when the Americans in the colonies, the other colonies outside of New York, started issuing privateering licenses, the loyalists with deep pockets and the merchants still in New York decided to issue their own letters of marque. Now, initially, Great Britain didn't allow the issuance of letters of marque. They were going to rely on their Royal Navy. They also thought at the outset of the war that the war would be over very, very quickly. As the war dragged on and come 1777, that's when Great Britain decided to pull the trigger and allow for British privateers. And soon thereafter, the New Yorkers got on the bandwagon and they issued many, many letters of marque. They captured many American ships. One of the letters of marque that they issued was these women got together in New York and they raised a subscription to fund a privateer that was sent out that did somewhat successful. It was somewhat successful. But the thing that was really neat about it, or interesting, is the New York newspapers, which were still publishing during the American Revolution, were talking about how these women were going to show those rebels, teach them a lesson with their privateering vessel. And it was really interesting to read the patriotic British language that was used, much like the patriotic language that was used in the colonial newspapers to help bulk up or make Americans feel more confident they might actually win this war against the most powerful nation of the day. But another aspect of the New York story that I found was interesting is, part of Long Island was under New York's control, not the entire part of it. And in Connecticut, Governor Trumbull decided that one way to annoy the British was to issue letters of marque to whaleboats and very small vessels that would leave from New York or Connecticut harbors, sail across Long Island Sound, which is a quick sail, or row across, and either capture British ships or sometimes get out of their boats and go and attack local British interests. So it became this whaleboat war in Long Island Sound that caused the British a lot of headaches, and was just another fascinating little side story in the American Revolution.
You mentioned earlier that many of these privateers were merchant ships or fishing boats or other vessels that were reconfigured for privateering. But did they, at some point, did they start building ships specifically for privateering?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, early on, they had to go with what they had. Even the Continental Navy, when the Continental Navy decided to launch, they were going to build some ships, but it took some time. So in the interim, they got some large merchant ships. So they purchased ships from other powers and sent them out as part of their Continental Navy. The privateers, initially, most of the privateering vessels were converted merchant vessels and or fishing vessels. But as the war dragged on, as more profits were made from privateering, and as merchant shipping was further damaged by the continuance of the war, a lot of these owners who had deep pockets decided, let me create or build some purpose-built privateers. And there were quite a few that were built. The most famous of which is the Grand Turk, which was built by a guy named Elias Haskett Derby out of Salem, Massachusetts, which is right next to where I live, just a couple of miles away. Elias Haskett Derby was wealthy before the war. He made a lot of money investing in and or owning dozens of privateers. but he also built the Grand Turk, which was well over 100 feet long, had something on the order of 24 to 30 cannons, depending on how you configured it, and was a huge, powerful ship. But he didn't launch it until the very end of the war. It had a couple of engagements during the war, brought back some British ships, but then the war ended, and actually the Grand Turk became one of the first American ships to go to China and the launching of the China trade. And one of the fascinating things I learned about privateering or about American history in writing this book was that years ago I wrote a book called When America First Met China, which is all about the China trade. And I wrote about all these American ships, including the Grand Turk, which went to China to launch the China trade. I had almost no knowledge of privateering at the time, and I didn't know that a lot of the merchant ships that after the war spread out over the world essentially to introduce American goods to the world now that they weren't under the thumb of the British. A lot of those ships were former privateers that once the war ended, they were converted into merchantmen. And the Grand Turk is one of the best examples of that.
Now, you mentioned also that some of the opposition to privateering was because it undermined the Republican values or the Republican ideals of the Revolution. What were those ideals and what were people concerned about?
Well, the main idea is sort of not abstract, but it was almost the concept of sort of like Cincinnatus and George Washington at the end of the war not becoming king. You know, he was doing the responsible civic thing by stepping away and having a democratic process. The civic virtue part of it was that we were patriots, we were fighting for a good cause, we were fighting for our country to be, and you should, if you're called up to duty, or you should volunteer for duty because it was the patriotic, civically responsible thing to do, to fight for your nation, to fight for your family, to fight for future generations. And it's sort of an abstract kind of concept. And many of the people who fought in the American Revolution, both in the Navy, in the Continental Army, and privateers, were motivated by patriotic concerns. But even George Washington, who is somebody who liked to often bemoan the fact that there wasn't more civic virtue in the colonies and people weren't sacrificing enough just on principle, he wrote extensively about the fact that you cannot run a war if you depend only on civic virtue and responsibility. You have to have the opportunity for pecuniary or monetary success. And of course, he knew that firsthand because the Army, after a while, they weren't getting paid. They were going to go home. If they weren't going to get paid, they weren't going to fight. The Continental Navy is the same. They got a cut of the profits of the ships that they brought in. So even though George Washington and others used to bemoan privateering as being more greed motivated than patriotic, they realized that without the monetary component, they weren't going to be able to wage war. And even the comments of privateers themselves alluded to both sides of the coin. On the one hand, they knew that they were trying to make money, and that was something that they thought was a good idea. But on the other hand, they were also fighting for their country, and they felt that they were true patriots. And I think that privateersmen were no different than general populace in terms of the split between patriotic fervor and the desire to make money. In fact, if you look at the start of the American Revolution, the real reason the American Revolution occurred was because merchants and the elite didn't want to be meddled with by British policies telling them who they could trade with, how they could trade. And we also were rebelling against taxation without representation, at its base is a financial issue. So I think the whole distinction between patriotism and virtue and monetary gain and greed is sort of a false dichotomy, because if you're going to blame privateersmen for being only greedy, then you sort of have to put that same mirror on the rest of the people fighting for the American Revolution and all the people at home. I mean, the United States, the colonies before the American Revolution were one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest placed on a per capita basis in the whole British Empire, and even well beyond. It was based on making money. That was an important motive, but it's not the only motive, but it's an important element of fighting a war. And the Americans knew that. And privateers just, perhaps it was a little more bald-faced how they were going out for money than some of the other participants. So that's why people viewed them as being less than virtuous. But I think that it's a false dichotomy, and it's unfair criticism.
Talk about some of the relationships. There are actually quite a few navies during the war. The states had navies. There was a Continental Navy. George Washington created his own navy. Benedict Arnold had a navy on Lake Champlain.
Yeah.
That's a lot of navies during the course of this war. How did the privateers fit in with all of that?
Well, put yourself in the perspective at the beginning of the war. We don't have a navy. We don't have really any force at sea. So privateering was one way to sort of get a free navy. George Washington, who was given control of the Continental Army on July 5th of 1775, he suddenly realized that he had very little ammunition. He only had enough gunpowder for his men maybe to fire 9 shots. So that's not really a very effective way to wage war. So initially, he was not interested at all in developing any sort of navy, even though it was recommended to him to hire ships or have ships armed and run by men from the army to go out and capture British munition ships that were bringing supplies to the British Navy, which had blockaded or controlled Boston since very early on. But he was quickly convinced that this is something he should do. And in General George Washington's instructions, it said nothing about whether or not he could drum up a navy. So he decided on his own, without asking for permission, to come up with this quote unquote secret navy. And he put together a number of ships, including the Hannah and others. And they went out and they were very successful. They captured a number of very large British munition ships. And you could argue that if those ships hadn't gone out and they hadn't brought in the amount of ammunition, guns, gunpowder, and other supplies, the war might have ended very quickly for the Americans, who were very poorly supplied with gunpowder in particular, and balls. So balls and miniature balls for the rifles, or the muskets. So he established this secret navy, which was very effective, which only lasted for about a year and a half. And it actually, his secret navy and his success with his secret navy actually was part of the reason that the Continental Congress decided to go ahead with the Continental Navy in October of 1775. So you have the Continental Navy, which a well-run country or government with good funding would find it very difficult to come up with a navy out of thin air. But the Continental Congress was anything but. It wasn't well funded at all. It wasn't smoothly operating, and they had a really difficult time pulling together the Continental Navy. Nevertheless, they came up with a total of 68 ships, some of which were purpose-built, some of which were bought from France, some of which were former merchantmen transformed into naval ships. And although they had some successes like John Paul Jones, and they captured about 200 British ships, by and large, the American Continental Navy did not contribute much to the success of the war. And John Adams, who was a big fan of the Navy, in 1781 wrote that looking over the history of our Continental Navy, it's really hard to avoid tears because of how unsuccessful, relatively, they were. So, and then there were state navies. A lot of states like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Philadelphia, they issued their own, they sent out their own naval forces. And those were very successful. So I didn't mean to discount the Continental Navy too much. The Continental Navy, state navies, George Washington's private navy, all played an important role in the evolution and success of the American Revolution. However, privateers were by far the most numerous and the most effective maritime force that the American colonies were able to put forth during the war. There were something on the order of maybe 1,400, 1,600 American privateers. There were probably 20 to 30,000 men who served on those privateering vessels, if not more. And they brought in nearly 2,000 British prizes. So even though we had 4 maritime forces that were fighting on our behalf during the war, it was really privateering that were the premier fighting force during the conflict.
Well, we've been speaking with Eric Jay Dolin. He is the author of Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution. Eric, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Listeners like you make PCN programming possible. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN Select app. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit pcntv.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.